Nobody in the 42-story glass tower on Lakeshore Drive ever looked twice at Grace Whitfield. That was the point. For 3 years, she had carried Alessandro Conti's coffee, his contracts, and his silences. And in 3 years, he had never once said her name like it mattered. She was furniture with a pulse, or so everyone believed, right up until the night the whole empire went silent, and Alessandro Conti stood in front of 200 of the most dangerous men on the eastern seaboard, and said her name like it was the only truth he had left to protect. That night was still months away. On the morning this story begins, Grace was exactly what she had always been: early, quiet, invisible. She arrived before the sun cleared the lake, before the guards changed shift, before the man everyone in that building feared had even stepped out of his car. She knew his schedule the way she knew the layout of numbers on a ledger, instinctively, completely, without ever needing to be told twice. It was a skill nobody upstairs had bothered to notice, because nobody upstairs had bothered to look past the word assistant, stitched quietly into her existence. What they didn't know was that Grace Whitfield remembered everything. Every number she had ever seen stayed lodged behind her eyes, sharp and complete, the way other people remembered a song. She had grown up correcting her father's business books at the kitchen table before she was old enough to drive, and later, in a different life, she had built a career auditing companies that didn't want to be audited. That career had ended the night her older brother, Daniel, was found dead in a parking garage 2 blocks from Conti Holdings, ruled an accident by a police department that filed the case away faster than any accident deserved. Grace had believed almost nothing about that night, except one thing. Her brother had been trying to hand someone evidence the week he died, and the trail of that evidence led, eventually, quietly, patiently, into the very building where she now poured coffee for the man everyone assumed had ordered the kill. She had taken the assistant job under a different last name. She had let them see a soft-spoken woman who flinched at raised voices and never asked questions. She let them believe it because being underestimated was the only weapon she had left. Alessandro Conti did not believe it. Not entirely. Not from the first week. He was 36 years old, and by the time he inherited what his father built, he had already buried more men than most soldiers see in a lifetime. Some by his own hand, most by his order, all of them necessary in the particular arithmetic of his world. He did not raise his voice. He had never needed to. Men who worked for him said that the quietest room in the building was the one Alessandro Conti walked into, because silence traveled ahead of him like a warning. He wore no rings, no watches, nothing that could be used to read him. The only thing he ever carried that meant anything was a scarred silver lighter that had belonged to his father, and he turned it over in his fingers only when he was deciding whether someone in front of him would live to see the following week. He noticed Grace the way he noticed everything, slowly, silently, and completely. Not her face first. Her habits, the way she never once repeated herself when he changed his mind about a meeting time, the way she never apologized for things that weren't her fault, the way most people around him did, reflexively, like apology was oxygen, the way her eyes moved over a spreadsheet the same way his own moved over a room full of armed men, cataloging, calculating, missing nothing. It unsettled him. He did not like being unsettled. For a long time, he told himself it was suspicion, nothing more. A man in his position survived by trusting no one completely, and a woman who watched numbers the way she watched him deserved watching in return. He had his head of security, Marco DeLuca, run the standard check on her when she was hired, the kind of check that came back clean because Grace had built the false trail herself, carefully, months before she ever applied. Marco reported nothing unusual. Alessandro kept watching anyway. Instinct, in his world, outlived paperwork every time. Before we go any further into what happened between them, and it goes somewhere neither of them intended. If you're the kind of person who's drawn to stories about power, obsession, and the long fuse before the truth finally explodes, hit that like button and subscribe to the Mafia Boss Stories. And tell me honestly in the comments, if you were sitting on evidence that could burn down the most dangerous man in the city, and he started looking at you like you were the only person in the room worth looking at. Would you run, or would you stay to finish what you started? Grace stayed. Not because she wanted to, because leaving would have meant abandoning the only lead she had ever found in 3 years of searching for the truth about her brother. The first real crack in the distance between them came on a Tuesday in October, on a night that was never supposed to matter. Alessandro had a dinner running late with the supplier from Baltimore, a man named Reyes, who talked too much and drank more than he should have around people who remembered everything he said. Grace was still in the office at 9:30, finishing a reconciliation nobody had asked her to finish, because the numbers on Conti Holdings' shipping manifests had stopped adding up 3 weeks earlier, and she needed to know exactly where the gap was before anyone else noticed she'd found it. She didn't hear him come in. "You're still here," Alessandro said, and his voice in an empty office at that hour did something to the air in the room, made it heavier, made every small sound after it. The hum of the copier, the tick of the wall clock. Sound suddenly very loud. Grace didn't jump. That, more than anything, was what made him stop in the doorway instead of continuing toward his office. Most people jumped. "Someone has to keep the books honest," she said, without looking up, and immediately regretted the word honest, because it sat too close to the truth she was hiding, and she watched, carefully from the corner of her eye, to see if it landed on him the way it had almost slipped out of her. It didn't land the way she feared. It landed differently. Alessandro crossed the room slower than he needed to, the way a man moves when he's deciding whether to let himself be curious about something he knows he shouldn't want. He stopped at the edge of her desk and looked down at the spreadsheet still open on her screen, and for 3 full seconds, an eternity, in the currency of a man who measured most conversations in half sentences, he said nothing at all. "You circled something," he said finally. Grace's pulse did not change on the outside. Inside, it detonated. "Rounding error," she said. "Freight companies, not ours." He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that made most people in that building start talking just to fill the silence, offering up explanations nobody had asked for, apologizing for sins they hadn't committed. Grace didn't offer anything. She held his eyes and let the silence sit there between them, unbothered, and something in Alessandro's chest, something he would have denied having if anyone had been reckless enough to ask, turned over slowly, like a key finding a lock it had been searching for without knowing it. "Go home, Miss Whitfield," he said, and there was something almost gentle underneath the command, something none of his men had ever heard in his voice and would not have believed if they had. "The numbers will still be wrong tomorrow." There were other nights before that pattern took hold, nights Grace never spoke of to anyone, because they belonged to a version of her 3 years old and buried. She remembered her father's voice at the kitchen table, patient and tired, teaching her to read a balance sheet the way other fathers taught their children to read novels. She remembered Daniel laughing at her for finding the numbers more interesting than the boys at school, and she remembered, with a clarity that never dulled no matter how many years passed, the last phone call she'd had with him. 3 sentences, cut short, his voice tight with something she hadn't recognized as fear until it was too late to matter. "Find the freight numbers," he'd said. "Something's wrong with the freight numbers." She had spent 3 years chasing the ghost of that unfinished sentence, through spreadsheets, shell companies, and finally through the front doors of Conti Holdings itself. And every quiet night, she stayed late at her desk. She told herself it was for Daniel, only for Daniel, and nothing else. She was not prepared for how quickly that certainty would erode. It happened in small increments she barely noticed until they had already accumulated into something dangerous. The way Alessandro began arriving earlier, not because his schedule demanded it, but because, though he never said it aloud, he had started timing his mornings to overlap with hers. The way he stopped sending memos through intermediaries and started walking them to her desk himself, standing a beat longer than the task required, watching her read them with an attention that had nothing to do with business. The other assistants noticed before Grace allowed herself to. They whispered about it in the break room, careful and hushed, the way people whisper about weather patterns that might become a storm. Grace heard them and said nothing, because saying something would have meant admitting that she had started listening for the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, the same way she used to listen for numbers that didn't add up, with a focus that frightened her. Alessandro, for his part, fought the pull with the same discipline he applied to everything else in his life. He had learned early, watching his father, that a boss who let his guard down for a woman was a boss who eventually buried people he loved. He told himself Grace was an anomaly to be studied, nothing more. A variable in his organization he hadn't yet solved. He repeated that explanation to himself through October and into November, through late nights and quiet conversations that lasted longer than either of them intended, until the explanation wore thin enough that even he could no longer pretend to believe it. Late nights that overlapped, small exchanges that meant more than their words. He started asking her opinion in meetings where her opinion had never been asked for before, watching the way the room recalibrated around the fact that Alessandro Conti was listening to his assistant, like her judgment carried weight. Some of the men in that room did not like it. Marco De Luca, in particular, watched it with an expression Grace cataloged and filed away the same way she filed away every irregular number, carefully, silently, for later. She should have pulled back. She knew that. Every rule she had built her false identity around told her to remain background noise, to stay unremarkable, to let the investigation move at its own careful pace without ever becoming visible to the man at the center of it. But there was something in the way Alessandro Conti looked at her that made the careful architecture of her plan feel, for the first time in 3 years, dangerously fragile. Not because he suspected her, but because some nights she caught herself wanting him to. That was the danger nobody warns you about in a story like this one. Not the guns. Not the men who disappeared when Alessandro decided they'd outlived their usefulness. The real danger was quieter than that. It was the way his attention slowly stopped feeling like a threat and started feeling like gravity, pulling her toward a man she had spent 3 years building a case to destroy. The night everything nearly broke came in December, at the company's winter gala. The one event each year where every partner, rival, and quiet enemy of Conti Holdings gathered under the same roof to smile at each other over champagne while calculating exactly how much damage they could do if the lights went out. Grace wasn't supposed to attend. Assistants didn't. But 3 days before the gala, Alessandro told her, in a tone that made it clear it wasn't a request, that he wanted her there, not working the room, not managing logistics, simply there, in a way he did not bother to explain, and she did not ask him to. She wore navy blue, nothing that drew attention, and still felt every eye in the room shift toward her the moment Alessandro crossed the floor and stood beside her rather than at the head of the room where his father used to stand. Marco De Luca watched them from across the ballroom with a stillness that Grace recognized immediately, because she had spent years learning to read exactly that kind of stillness in men who were deciding how to remove an inconvenience. "You look like you're calculating something," Alessandro murmured, close enough that only she could hear it. "Everyone here's calculating something," Grace said. "I'm just better at hiding it than most of them." "Not from me," he said, and there was no threat in it, only a fact laid down between them like a card on a table. I've been watching you for months, Grace. I know when you're hiding something. I've simply been deciding whether I care." Her heart didn't stop. It did something worse. It kept beating, steady and exposed, while she searched his face for the anger she expected and found something else entirely. Not suspicion, not yet accusation. Something closer to an invitation, dangerous and quiet, asking her to trust him with whatever it was she was carrying. She almost did. She had her mouth half open around the beginning of a truth 3 years in the making when Marco De Luca appeared at Alessandro's shoulder with a tight, urgent expression and murmured something about a shipment problem that needed him immediately, and the moment closed like a door, swinging shut on its own weight. It would be 2 more weeks before Grace understood exactly how close that door had come to changing everything, and exactly how much Marco De Luca had been listening. In those 2 weeks, the tower on Lakeshore Drive felt different to her, charged in a way she couldn't name and didn't trust. Alessandro grew quieter around her, not colder, but careful. The way a man grows careful when he's decided something important and hasn't yet found the courage to say it aloud. Twice he started a sentence that began with her name and ended in silence, and both times Grace felt the unfinished words sit in the air between them long after he'd walked away. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself that whatever was building between them would have to wait, because the ledger in front of her was finally close to giving up its secret, and she owed her brother's memory more than the distraction of wanting a man she had come there to destroy. She did not know, in those 2 weeks, that Marco De Luca had been watching her with a different kind of attention entirely. Not the slow, reluctant fascination Alessandro carried, but the cold, assessing calculation of a man who had survived 15 years in a violent world by noticing exactly when the walls were closing in. He had seen the pattern of her late nights. He had seen which files she pulled and which ones she returned a little too quickly, a little too carefully squared at the edges. He had, in fact, known who she really was for nearly a month before he finally decided what to do about it, weighing the cost of silence against the cost of action with the same patience Grace had used to build her case against him. In the end, it was not caution that moved him to act. It was fear. The particular, corrosive fear of a man who has spent years believing himself untouchable, watching that belief crack for the first time. The gap in the shipping manifests, the one Grace had been quietly tracing since October, finally resolved itself into a shape she recognized with a cold, sick certainty. It wasn't Alessandro skimming from his own empire. It was Marco. 3 years of falsified freight numbers, money bled slowly out of legitimate shipments and laundered through a chain of shell companies that led, eventually, impossibly, back to the same names that had appeared in the evidence her brother Daniel had died trying to deliver. Daniel hadn't been killed on Alessandro Conti's order. He'd been killed because he'd found Marco De Luca's theft first, and Marco had made sure he never told anyone what he'd found. Grace sat with that truth alone in her apartment for 11 hours, turning it over the way Alessandro turned over his father's lighter, deciding what it meant, deciding what to do with a man she had come to Conti Holdings intending to destroy, and instead found herself, impossibly, unforgivably, falling for. She should have gone straight to Alessandro. She told herself that 100 times in the days that followed. But telling him meant telling him everything. Her real name, her brother. 3 years of lies built into every conversation they'd ever had. And some fragile, frightened part of her wasn't ready to watch his face change when he learned exactly how completely she had deceived him. Marco De Luca did not give her the luxury of more time. He found her alone in the records room on a Thursday evening, the building nearly empty, and closed the door behind him with a quiet click that Grace heard the way other people hear a gunshot. "You've been careful," Marco said, leaning against the filing cabinets, with the relaxed posture of a man who had already decided how this conversation would end. 3 years careful, I'll give you that. But careful isn't the same as invisible, Miss Whitfield. Or should I call you Miss Prescott? Your father's name. The one you were born with, before you started auditing companies that don't like being audited." Grace's blood went cold, but her voice, when it came, was steady in the way she had trained it to be steady for years. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Your brother talked too much before he died," Marco said. And there it was, the confession she'd spent 3 years chasing, delivered casually, almost bored, by a man who clearly believed he was about to eliminate the last loose end of a mistake he'd made years ago. "I've been waiting to see if you were smart enough to find what he found. Looks like you were." "Shame it won't matter." He moved toward her, and for the first time in 3 years of careful invisibility, Grace understood that all her patience, all her calculation, had led her to exactly this moment. Alone, unarmed, in a locked room with the man who had murdered her brother and now intended to make sure she disappeared the same way. What Marco DeLuca did not know, what almost no one in that building knew, was that Grace Whitfield had not spent 3 years only learning numbers. She had spent 3 years before Conti Holdings training in exactly the kind of close-quarters defense that a woman investigating dangerous men learns to survive by. It was a skill she had buried as deep as her real name, saved for exactly one purpose, and as Marco reached for her, Grace moved first. Fast, precise, brutal in a way that made him stumble back into the filing cabinets, with blood already sliding from his split lip, staring at her like he was seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time. "You're not what I thought," he said, and there was something almost like respect buried under the fury in his voice. "Neither was my brother," Grace said, "and you killed him anyway." The door opened before Marco could reach for the gun beneath his jacket. Alessandro Conti stood in the frame, and the stillness that filled the room in that instant was unlike any silence Grace had ever heard him carry. Not calculated, not controlled. Raw. He had come looking for her because she'd left a meeting without a word, an irregularity so unlike her that it had pulled him out of his own office in a way nothing else could have. What he found instead was his most trusted man with blood on his mouth and murder in his eyes, standing over the woman Alessandro had spent months slowly, helplessly, letting himself want. "Alessandro," Marco started. "Don't," Alessandro said, and the single word carried more weight than every threat Marco had ever heard in 15 years of loyal service, because underneath the command was something Marco had never once seen in his boss's face before. Fear. Real fear. Not for himself. What followed happened fast enough that Grace would only fully understand the sequence of it later, replaying it in the quiet weeks afterward. Marco lunged for his weapon. Alessandro was faster, had always been faster, had survived exactly as long as he had, because he never once allowed himself the luxury of hesitation when it mattered. It ended in less than 10 seconds, and when it was over, Marco DeLuca was face down on the records room floor, disarmed and broken, and Alessandro Conti was standing over him with a stillness that terrified Grace more than anything Marco had said, because she understood, in that moment, exactly what kind of man she had let herself fall for. He didn't kill him. Not there. Not that night. Instead, he looked at Grace. Really looked at her, taking in the torn sleeve, the steady hands, the fury and grief written plainly across a face she had spent 3 years teaching to give nothing away, and something in him broke open completely. "Tell me everything," he said. Not a demand, a request, quiet and unguarded, from a man who had not asked anyone for anything in longer than he could remember. So she did. She told him about Daniel, about the parking garage, about the shell companies, and the falsified manifests, and 3 years of a false name worn like armor. She told him she'd come to his building to destroy him, and had instead found the truth was never his to answer for. She waited for his face to close, for the warmth she'd only recently learned to trust to vanish behind the cold authority she'd first met a year ago. It didn't happen. Alessandro Conti, who had buried men for lesser betrayals than 3 years of lies, looked at Grace Whitfield, at Grace Prescott, and said the only thing that mattered in that moment. "You didn't lie to survive me," he said. "You lied to survive what my organization let happen to your family. That's not something I punish, Grace. That's something I owe you for." The reckoning that followed was not quiet, and it was not private. Alessandro Conti did not simply remove Marco De Luca and bury the truth the way his father might have, the way the old rules of his world demanded. 2 weeks later, in front of 200 partners and rivals gathered for an emergency summit nobody had been warned about, Alessandro stood at the head of the room where his father used to stand, with Grace beside him. Not behind him, not carrying his coffee, but beside him, exactly where he had decided. Publicly, permanently, she belonged. He told them all of it. Marco's theft, Daniel Prescott's murder, and Grace, her real name, her real courage, 3 years of quiet, relentless intelligence that had uncovered a betrayal his own security apparatus had missed entirely. The room that had once looked through Grace Whitfield like she was furniture, now looked at her like she was the only person in it who had never once been fooled. "For 3 years, Alessandro said, his voice carrying to every corner of that silent room. "You all looked at this woman and saw nothing worth noticing. I want every one of you to understand exactly how wrong you were. She is the sharpest mind in this organization, and as of tonight, she answers to no one but me. And I answer, for the first time in my life, to someone besides myself." Grace stood in that silence and felt, for the first time in 3 years, the exact opposite of invisible. In the days immediately following, the tower on Lakeshore Drive did not simply return to what it had been. Word moved through the organization, the way water moves through cracked stone, quietly at first, then everywhere at once. Men who had walked past Grace Whitfield's desk for 3 years, without a second glance, now nodded to her in hallways, careful and a little uncertain, the way people greet someone whose true measure they have only just begun to understand. She did not enjoy the attention. She had spent 3 years cultivating invisibility as a form of protection, and it would take longer than a single gala to unlearn the instinct to disappear into a room. But she noticed, too, that she no longer needed to. Nobody was looking for a reason to underestimate her anymore, and there was a strange, unfamiliar relief in that. The relief of finally being seen exactly as she was, and finding that it did not cost her anything to be seen. Alessandro changed more slowly and more visibly than she expected. The cold authority that had defined him for as long as anyone in that building could remember did not disappear. It could not. Not in his world. Not in the position he still had to hold, with the same steel-like control that had kept him alive this long. But there were cracks in it now, small and deliberate, that he let Grace see when he let no one else see them. He told her, one quiet night weeks later, about his father, about the version of the man Alessandro had never spoken of to anyone, the version who had taught him that love in their world was a liability to be buried before it could be used as a weapon against you. He told her he had believed that lesson completely, without question, for 18 years, right up until a woman with a photographic memory and a false last name had walked into his office and made him doubt it. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, and the admission cost him something visible, something that would have looked, to anyone else who had ever feared him, like weakness. To Grace, it looked like the bravest thing she had ever heard him say. "I know how to run an empire. I know how to make men disappear who threaten what's mine. I don't know how to sit across from someone and simply want them to stay." "You're doing it right now," Grace said. "That's the whole skill. You just have to keep choosing it." He did keep choosing it, not perfectly, not without the old instincts pulling him back toward distance and control in moments when the world around him grew dangerous again, which it did, more than once, in the months that followed. But he chose it enough, consistently enough, that Grace stopped bracing herself for the version of him that might one day decide she was a liability instead of the truth he'd been protecting. She learned to trust the steadiness underneath the danger, the same way he had learned to trust the intelligence underneath her silence, and somewhere in that slow, deliberate unlearning of everything they'd both been taught about survival, they built something neither the Empire nor the enemies circling it could take away. Marco DeLuca stood trial in a courtroom that never appeared in any newspaper, presided over by men whose names would never be spoken outside the walls of that world. And the verdict was exactly what 15 years of betrayal and one murdered whistleblower demanded. Grace did not attend. She had spent 3 years chasing that reckoning, and when it finally came, she found she no longer needed to witness it, to feel the weight of it lift. Daniel's name was cleared quietly, through channels Alessandro controlled with the same precision he controlled everything else. And the false report that had called her brother's death an accident was corrected. Finally, in the only records that had ever truly mattered to her. What came after was not the end of danger. Men like Alessandro Conti do not simply walk away from their world, and the empire he ran would always carry its risks, its enemies, its long nights that demanded his cold authority again and again. But it was the end of the lie Grace had carried since the day she buried her brother, and the beginning of something neither of them had let themselves imagine was possible. A partnership built not on power and fear, but on the rare, dangerous honesty of two people who had finally stopped underestimating each other. Months later, on a quiet evening in the same office where it had all begun, Grace found Alessandro turning his father's old lighter over in his fingers, the way he always did when he was thinking. She didn't ask what he was deciding. She already knew. He looked up when she crossed the room, and for the first time since she'd known him, the calculation in his eyes had softened into something that looked, unmistakably, like peace. "Still finding rounding errors?" he asked. "Always," Grace said. "Someone has to keep the books honest." "I know a few people who disagree with that philosophy," Alessandro said. "Not anymore," Grace said. "You made sure of that." He reached for her hand, and in the quiet of that office, in the empire that once ran entirely on fear, something steadier had finally taken root. Not the absence of danger, but the presence, at last, of someone who had earned the right to stand beside him in it. If you were captivated by Grace's hidden strength, and Alessandro's dark, guarded obsession finally breaking open, don't forget to hit that like button. We love bringing you these intense stories filled with betrayal, power, and unexpected twists. What would you have done in Grace's shoes? Walk away the moment you found the truth, or stay and finish what you started? Drop a comment below and let us know. Make sure to subscribe to the Mafia Boss Stories and turn on notifications so you never miss a story.